Are you all sitting comfortably? And I'll begin. Perhaps not. Well, hello, everybody. For those that don't know, I'm Arlene Wilson, and I'm president of the Historic Society of Lancashire Cheshire. And I'd just like to welcome you all, members and guests, and this is our second Zoom lecture of 2021. Well, today I have the great pleasure to introduce Dr. Danny Evans, who's a lecturer in history at Liverpool Hope University and has been since January 2019. Prior to this, he taught at the IE University, which is an international university in Madrid, one of the largest in Spain of internationals. He gained his PhD from the University of Leeds and was published his monograph, which is entitled Revolution and the State, Anarchism in the Spanish Civil War, 2018. He also runs a podcast on radical history and politics with James Yeoman called ABC with Danny and Jim. And possibly he'll tell us a little bit about more than that. I was quite interested in that. Well, today's lecture is entitled Anarchism and Migration on Merseyside, 1897 to 1936. But before we start, I think somebody is helpfully going to mute everybody. So, but if you're not muted, could everybody mute themselves throughout the lecture? I think there will be time for some questions at the end. So over to you, Danny.
Well, thank you very much, Arlene, and thank you very much to the Society for inviting me to give this talk. The title of the talk is actually a bit different. So the title of the talk is Frontiers Are Unknown to Them, Anarchism and Internationalism Between Barcelona and Liverpool, 1897 to 1914. So sorry that you didn't get that memo, Arlene, but I hope anyway. Nobody's come under false pretenses and is concerned about that. Timeline cut off. Okay, so research into anarchism over the course of the present century has been characterized by the impact of the transnational turn in labour studies. Anarchism reached its peak of influence at the turn of the 20th century, the period of the so-called first globalization, when migration flows and enforced exile spread anarchist ideas beyond their original European strongholds. This transnational character reflected the internationalism of the creed's adherents. Men, the Liverpool Mercury noted in 1900, whose pride it is to declare that frontiers are unknown to them and that French, Germans and Italians belong to one family with a common cause, that of universal brotherhood. Many of these cosmopolitan dreamers, or forces of annihilation, to use the Mercury's preferred phrase, ended up in Britain, where at the end of the United Kingdom's liberal century, or so-called liberal century, no powers existed to refuse asylum to those fleeing persecution on the continent. In a context of imperial and racial anxieties, this situation could not last, and the Second Boer War, the Aliens Act, and British entry into World War I provide useful coordinates for charting the resolution of this crisis of liberalism in favour of racism and nationalism at the outset of the 20th century. But what of the road not taken, that path to universal brotherhood lit by the forces of annihilation? In this talk, I want to consider the specific challenge that anarchism posed to nationalism in this period and the obstacles that limited the effectiveness of this challenge by looking at how two episodes in the transnational history of Spanish anarchism played out in Liverpool. The first involves the enforced exile of Spanish anarchists after their imprisonment and torture in Barcelona in 1897 during the infamous Montjuic trials. The second relates to the influence of Francisco Ferrer y Guardia, an anarchist teacher executed in 1909 following the so-called Tragic Week in Barcelona. I will suggest that anarchism in Liverpool can be viewed as a rearguard action against what Marcel van der Linden has called the national integration of the European working classes. In examining these episodes, I'm departing from my research specialism in Civil War era Spanish anarchism and following a path well trodden by local and anarchist historians. And I'd like to acknowledge in particular the articles written by Liverpool Solidarity Federation, Nick Heath, Joselito Lopez, and the dramatisation of the meeting of Jim and Nellie Dick, in which participated my colleague at Liverpool Hope University, Gary Anderson. I'll also be putting the text of this talk on my academia page, where all of the references will be clearly marked. I'd also like to thank my friend and comrade, Jim Yeoman, for supplying me with a copy of Federico Urrala's autobiography. The talk is going to have 3 parts. The first, Spanish anarchists on the Mersey, the second, education for internationalism, and the third, syndicalism and national integration. Okay, so part 1 then. Are there any anarchists in Liverpool, organised or unorganised? So asked the Liverpool Mercury in 1894. The paper's correspondent could not be sure of an answer. While none were evident, the nature of a port city was such that one could never be sure of who might turn up and what alien ideas they might be bearing, albeit that the paper's readers could have every confidence in the vigilance of the police, who would speedily check any attempt of avowed wreckers to disturb social order here. While a reader of the Mercury attested to the contrary by pointing out in 1895 the agitation carried out by anarchists and other socialists every Sunday at the Wellington Monument, and the same year the Worcester Chronicle reported the arrest of an alleged anarchist haranguing the city's unemployed outside the Labour Exchange, the paper's editors had no doubt that anarchism, by contrast to other variants of socialism, was a foreign scourge. Reporting on the movement in 1900, the paper affirmed that the recent tranquility enjoyed by London was due to trained officers alert to every movement of these undesirable visitors. Though the writer was prepared to admit that it would not be difficult to name some half a dozen English members of the advanced school who would think nothing of killing a king, yet it remains the fact, generally speaking, that the violent, bloodthirsting anarchist is a foreigner. Incidentally, in Spain, which is justly recognized for the longevity and size of its anarchist movement, a similar wisdom prevailed, the Times reporting from Madrid in 1892 that as the anarchist propaganda in Spain is carried on principally by foreign subjects, the government has decided to take effective steps to prevent foreign agitators from coming into the country. Anarchism was rarely far from the front pages at the end of the 19th century. The spectacular and violent turn taken by the anarchist philosophy of propaganda by the deed led to a series of assassinations and outrages that provided plenty of grist to the millers of moral panic. In November 1893, Santiago Salvador threw 2 bombs into the orchestra pit in the Liceo Theatre in Barcelona. The following month, Auguste Vaillant threw a nail bomb in the French National Assembly. In February 1894, in the incident which inspired Conrad's The Secret Agent, Marshal Bourdin died accidentally in a premature explosion in Greenwich Park, and Émile Henry set off a bomb in the Café Terminus in Paris. And in June, Sante Geronimo Caserio stabbed the French president to death. The combination of horror and titillation provided by the gory details of such acts and their gruesome, picturesque protagonists led newspaper reporters in the UK to certain inescapable conclusions. Anarchism was irrational, it was violent, it was alien to British values, and it was the last resort of the desperate, degenerate poor. So it was with much hullabaloo that the great and good of Liverpool learned in July 1897 that it was to be the destination of the Isla de Luzon, a boat containing 28 Spanish anarchist deportees whom the authorities had failed to convict in the aftermath of a bomb attack which had taken place in Barcelona in June of the previous year. The bomb was thrown during a procession to celebrate the feast of Corpus Christi and had killed 12 people. The subsequent police raids targeted anarchists of all stripes, including those who had always condemned terrorism, with the result that around 400 people were imprisoned in the castle at Montjuic overlooking the city. Of these 400, 87 were brought to trial. Eventually, 5 people were executed and up to 20 condemned to life in prison, despite numerous claims that confessions were extracted under torture. And just as a content note, in a minute, I will relate some of those descriptions of torture methods. The remainder, despite being found not guilty and having already spent months in jail, where they too had been subjected to torture, were not put at liberty, but were instead deported as undesirables. After an international campaign prevented their being shipped to the Gold Coast, the detainees were instead obliged to pay for passage to their preferred destination. But their preferred destination of France being unprepared to accept them, they were packed off to England instead. Among their number were some of the most prominent figures in the movement in Spain, such as Juan Monsen, who wrote under the pen name of Federico Urales, and Teresa Claramunt. The Isla de Luzon docked at Barcelona after journeying from the Philippines, where the revolt against Spanish rule was ongoing. In Barcelona, the Spanish deportees were exchanged for Philippine prisoners, and the ship proceeded on its journey to Liverpool. Reports of the torture at Montjuic had resulted in an international campaign of condemnation. In June, the prison reformer and secretary of the Howard Association, William Tallack, wrote to the Times that these charges allege against the Spanish authorities in many places the infliction of barbarous tortures, such as the burning of flesh with hot irons, tearing out fingernails with pincers, bodily mutilations, compression of the skull by metal instruments, and other modes of treatment, both indecent and savage. These statements have come from so many sources and so repeatedly that it is impossible to regard them as being without foundation. However, Tallack went on to say that at least as far as anarchists are concerned, it must be admitted that the Spanish authorities and people have received extreme provocation. Ignoring the certain innocence of the vast majority, if not all, of those tortured in the aftermath of the Corpus Christi bombing, Tallack affirmed that these dastardly outrages are in the nostrils of mankind as the fetid repulsiveness of the most nauseous of animals. If Tallack's response to the torture of anarchists mixed humanitarian and dehumanizing language, there was no such ambiguity for Mr. J. A. Willox, the MP for Everton. Perturbed at the imminent arrival of such undesirables in his own backyard, Willox stood up in the House of Commons to beg of the Under Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs whether Her Majesty's government are taking any steps to prevent the alleged deportation of Spanish anarchists to the United Kingdom, and what measures the local authorities at Liverpool can take to prevent the landing at that port of dangerous and destitute aliens who, as in many previous instances, may, if landed, become a charge upon the local rates. The great attention drawn to the case of the Spanish anarchists ensured a sizable crowd gathered to see them into port. Newspapers reported that, unable to make its way up to the dock because of the tide, a tug was sent into the Mersey, containing Chief Detective Inspector Strettle and several of his detective staff, to take charge of the passengers for the final stretch of their journey. Sympathisers, journalists, and curious onlookers craned their necks to catch a glimpse of the frightening new arrivals. They were to be disappointed, however. Disembarking, the Spaniards, according to reports, presented a rather well-to-do appearance. The majority of them appeared to belong to the better class, far removed from the snarling and ragged freaks of bourgeois legend. The anarchists, in their turn, were amazed to find the customs officials take their word for the nature of their baggage and for the solicitude shown them by the police. Watched over by detectives, the exiles were greeted by a delegation of local socialists and taken to a building known as the Ark in Kensington, which is pictured here, the headquarters of the recently formed Independent Labour Party, the ILP, and the Clarion Cycling Club, where a party was held in their honour. Federico Urales, who's pictured here on the right, described the reception they were given in his autobiography. Presented with cake and Spanish fruit, despite communication difficulties, the anarchists answered the questions of their well-wishers, and exiles and natives took it in turns to sing songs. The party finished in the early hours, wrote Urales, after the English men and women had stood and with solemn faces sung God Save the King. How strange this seemed. Socialists or syndicalists or what have you, because there are all kinds in the trade unions, singing the royal anthem, So it would seem that in this country, the customs officials will take your word of honour, the police are more attentive and obliging than a duke's servant, and the people of advanced ideas, because those who looked after us were certainly progressives, solemnly sing an anthem in which God is asked to save the king. The Spaniards were put up for the night in the Ark before spending the following day sightseeing and then embarking on a train for London, where a huge crowd gathered to see them off with flowers and cheers. Mr. J. A. Willock's MP's fears that they would remain in Liverpool and be a burden on the rates proved unfounded. On the 2nd of August, the Liverpool Mercury published a note from P. Pemberton, chair of the West Derby branch of the ILP, thanking all comrades and friends, in or out of the labour movement, for their prompt, able and practical assistance to us in entertaining the Spaniards who have been expelled their native country. It is very encouraging to feel that the bond of fraternity and brotherhood was extended to all in a true cosmopolitan and sympathetic spirit. Our special thanks are due to Sergeant Detective Osborne for his valuable services rendered as interpreter. Perhaps accepting the friendly police, in some respects, this episode is a familiar one. A media-driven panic based on scare stories, alleged incompatibility of outlook, and dehumanization led to political wrangling and bureaucratic maneuvering to try and deny asylum to torture victims. Despite the effective demonization of the new arrivals, a grassroots effort based on mutual aid and solidarity provided them with a welcome and a roof over their heads. In other respects, though, the controversy occasioned by the arrival of Spanish anarchist refugees invites reflection on a set of historical issues whose stakes are often overlooked, the outcome of which taken to be inevitable. As I mentioned earlier, the period under discussion falls into the time span when what Marcel van der Linden has described as the national integration of the working class entered its moments of culmination and potential crisis in Europe. From being necessary adjuncts to the machine age, whose poverty and loose morals only confirmed their infirm humanity, in the epoch of mass politics and imperial rivalry, the creation of ideologically as well as economically incorporated subjects was necessary if wars were to be fought and elections to be won. The discursive creation of the anarchist as the anti-national figure par excellence was a useful other to the wholesome and industrious native son of toil, and provided essential background colour to the politics of migrant bashing and anti-Semitism that led to the first UK Aliens Act in 1905. Yet anarchism is important to this story in another way, as that element of socialism most opposed to this process of integration into the nation state. In that sense, the mixture of international solidarity and national pride that so surprised Federico Urales is worth reflecting on. The fact that Spanish anarchists were met by a delegation from the ILP and housed in the party's local headquarters may surprise those more accustomed to histories of socialism benighted by sectarianism and infighting. The episode is nevertheless revealing of the overlaps that characterized turn-of-the-century socialism in Britain, even as ideological distinctions within the movement were becoming more sharply defined. A glance at the career of the Liverpool-born artist Walter Crane is indicative of what I'm describing here. That Crane, born on Maryland Street off Hope Street in 1845, was able to lend his talents to such diverse causes as working class internationalism, the commemoration of the Paris Commune, the Haymarket Martyrs, Esperanto, Louise Michel's School for Refugees, the Fabian Society, and the Imperial Federation League, does not indicate either an unscrupulous mercenary or hopeless confusion, but rather signals the jumble of intersecting concerns whose contradictions were only gradually discerned in the years preceding the First World War, most notably the way in which professed internationalism was rarely effectively disentangled from a racialized national imaginary. Crane links to a key institution which further complicates the picture. The Clarion, the socialist newspaper founded by Robert Blatchford in 1891, whose enormous success led to an unprecedented nationwide network of houses and clubs, with those devoted to cycling, whose logo Crane designed, probably the most famous. In Bernard Semmel's Imperialism and Social Reform, Blatchford famously the author of Merry England, is numbered alongside leading Fabians as a proponent of imperial socialism, and his autobiography quoted as affirming of himself and his Clarion colleagues, "We were Britons first and socialists next." It is therefore less surprising that Spanish anarchists should find their Liverpudlian welcome party concluding with a rendition of God Save the King, particularly when one considers that the Ark was the headquarters of the local Clarion Cycling Club and that there was a considerable overlap of adherents to the ILP, the Fabian Society, and the Clarion in the city. Eleanor Keeling of Wavertree, for example, was a member of the former two organisations and the founder of the Clarion's women's column. In 1895, she advertised the socialist youth club she had started as the Liverpool Young Merry Englanders Club. It was at least partly through opposing such social patriotism, particularly in the field of education, that anarchism was able to carve a niche for itself in Britain at the turn of the 20th century. And this provides important context to the foothold it established through practical activity in Liverpool. Yet, as we will see, the light of universal brotherhood struggled to emerge from the shadows of imperial socialism. The new century saw a decline in spectacular terrorism as a tactic of anarchism. These years saw significant anarchist regroupment in various countries and an increasing influence in the labour movement through syndicalism. Unsurprisingly, without a grisly focus, media attention on anarchists declined in proportion to the movement's growth, incoherence, and substance, although it was to make a disastrous reappearance, as we shall see. Thus, it was when local journalists stopped looking for alien anarchist bogeymen in Liverpool that they began to make an appearance. Guy Aldred, one of the key figures in the history of British anarchism, known both affectionately and otherwise as the guy they all dread, wrote in 1907, the year of the Spanish anarchist Lorenzo Portet's arrival in the city, that he found a considerable leaven of anarchism amidst the general ideas of the man in the street, and that although only organised in June, the English movement is strong here, whilst the same is true of the Jewish and Spanish movements. The embryonic movement in the city, which never grew beyond this stage, provides a small case study of what was a transnational anarchist turn towards education in the early 1900s. Francisco Ferrer y Guardia was the man most associated with anarchist understandings of education, and he became the focus of an in the event unsuccessful transnational campaign aimed at averting his execution by the Spanish state at the end of 1909. Ferrer had established the modern school in Barcelona in 1901. This is an image on the right here of its bulletin, and contributed to the transnational network that mobilized in his name by founding the International League for the Rational Education of Children. In the name of the League, Ferrer traveled abroad and encouraged the foundation of schools inspired by his pedagogical ideas. These trips took in Liverpool in the summer of 1907, where he was able to meet his old comrade Lorenzo Portet, photographed at the top here, who was employed as a Spanish teacher at the city's School of Commerce, founded in 1898. Portet and Ferrer had met in exile in France at the end of the 19th century, Portet escaping over the border from Catalonia during the police raids that followed the Corpus Christi bombing. One who knew him in those days described him on the eve of his exile. His aspect was terrible. In his eyes there shone an ill-defined yet formidable threat that disappeared into the middle distance, something akin to the gaze of a lion who feels itself full of strength and justice, but is whipped in the face and locked in an unbreakable cage. According to Margaret Sanger, the pioneering advocate of birth control who had a romantic relationship with Portet after meeting him in the Liverpool Clarion Cafe in 1914, it was chiefly due to his efforts that the tortures in Montjuic were made known to the French public, while other sources attest to Portet's likely involvement in the revenge killing of Antonio Cánovas del Castillo, the Spanish Prime Minister, through direct aid provided to his assassin, Michele Angiolillo. In this sense, Portet formed a bridge between the epochs of violence and education in the anarchist movement. It was at least partly due to his influence that Ferrer's anti-clerical republicanism took on increasingly anarchist characteristics. In the words of Sanger, Ferrer created a new idea of education in Spain, of anti-church, anti-capitalism, anti-patriotism, anti-militarism, and combined these teachings in the modern school for the promotion of universal peace through economic justice. A premium was placed on children connecting with nature, with excursions out of the schoolroom and into the countryside becoming a recurring feature of institutions in the modern school tradition. When Ferrer came to Liverpool, Portet introduced him to Jim Dick, who is in the photograph here at the bottom. Dick was a Liverpoolite-born local anarchist who had met Portet while enrolled at the commercial school. Together, the two men founded the Liverpool Anarchist Sunday School, also known as the Communist Sunday School, the terms being more or less interchangeable before 1917, in November 1908. In a note to the anarchist newspaper Freedom, Dick explained the school's purpose: to break down national prejudices and that patriotic piffle which is inculcated into the children in our present-day school is, to my mind, the finest propaganda we can do to ensure the solidarity of the workers of all nations. We of the Communist School intend to work in our small sphere to this end. The project attained significant, albeit small-scale success, with numbers of attendees rising and the program of classes expanding over the next few years, during which time a more child-centered pedagogy based on Froebel's kindergarten theory was added to the school's countercultural anti-nationalism. Elements of this anti-nationalist education included the singing in French of the Internationale and can be further discerned from a report on the school's activity in May 1909, which included a talk by William Fairbrother dissecting the jingoistic play An Englishman's Home, then showing in Liverpool. Then, according to the report, May 24th being Empire Day, our young comrades distributed 2,000 leaflets of Our Great Empire, published by Freedom, as an antidote to the prevailing patriotic bombast that the day schools were giving. Undoubtedly, anti-jingoism was a defining feature of British anarchism in this period. In February 1909, Freedom carried a review of An Englishman's Home, which noted that there isn't a nation that has done more than England to destroy the homes of other people. Sadly, William Fairbrother, who deconstructed the play for the benefit of the Sunday school's pupils, died of pneumonia shortly after giving his talk at just 23 years of age. And the Sunday schoolers would soon suffer another blow when their chief inspiration, Francisco Ferrer, was executed by the Spanish state at the end of 1909. Ferrer was made a scapegoat after the so-called Tragic Week in Barcelona, when protests against the drafting of reserve troops to fight in Spanish Morocco led to riots and widespread church burning. The martyrdom of Ferrer was seen as vindication of the educationalists' anti-clericalism, as the church was widely seen as influential in his execution. Such considerations have led the historian Geoffrey Fiddler to suggest that with its history of bitter sectarian rivalry and of Catholic and church-dominated schooling, Liverpool evidently furnished Dick, Portet, and other anarchists with a direct replica of Ferrer's Barcelona. However apposite this comparison may have been, it must be remembered that the Ferrer-inspired Sunday schools were much more modest than the modern school in Barcelona, the former providing a supplementary corrective to mainstream schooling, whereas the latter aimed to establish an alternative system of primary education altogether. Ferrer's legacy in Spain was assured up to the establishment of the Franco dictatorship by the development and growth of what came to be known as anarcho-syndicalism. Anarchists of an educational bent were provided with the resources of a mighty labour organisation, the National Confederation of Labour, the CNT, to set up rational schools which provided thousands of workers' children with schooling. Viewed from this perspective, the fate of the Liverpool Anarchist Sunday School was also dependent on anarchism gaining a foothold within syndicalism, which emerged as an independent and seemingly formidable current within the British labour movement in these years. Liverpudlian anarchists made early efforts in this regard with a branch of the Industrial Union of Direct Actionists set up in 1907 by Mark Kavanagh. Meetings were held in the ILP rooms at Tagus Street in Liverpool 8, and a note to Freedom in August 1908 reported that the heartiness with which both the ILP and Social Democratic Party comrades entered into the spirit of the idea would raise the hopes of the veriest pessimist. Despite the optimistic tone, the report illustrates that Liverpool anarchism remained a minority current within a broader heterodox socialist milieu in which it sought out converts. An early report on the Sunday School confirmed that a fundraising event had been held at the Clarion Club, which was also given, along with the name of Lorenzo Portet, as the correspondence address of the International League for the Rational Education of Children. The school, meanwhile, after beginning life at the Toxteth Cooperative Hall on Smithdown Road, changed premises to the ILP's rooms at Tager Street. At a time of sharpening political division and in a context of impending imperial showdown, the continued coexistence of the school's anti-nationalist agenda alongside the parliamentarism of the ILP and outright jingoism of the Clarion could not be taken for granted. The stakes were made clear at the end of 1910, when the siege of Sydney Street brought the perils of alien anarchism back to the front pages of the press. And in the new year, the newspaper, now titled The Daily Post and Mercury, resumed its hunt for anarchists in Liverpool, which it decreed the most active centre of anarchism outside of London, warning its readers that in some places revolutionary schools are set up where children are practiced in revolutionary songs and brought up in the ways of violence. Amidst the moral panic, the ILP closed its doors to the anarchist Sunday School. Such circumstances heightened the desirability of anarchist and syndicalist cooperation in the tumultuous year of 1911, when freedom was to observe happily that our anarchist propaganda of revolutionary initiative and direct action was long and difficult, but it may be said that revolutionary syndicalism is now a living force among the working classes. The following year, Edward Carpenter wrote on the front page of the new weekly publication, The Anarchist, that the rapid growth of the syndicalist movement is surely an encouraging sign of the times and a matter of congratulation to anarchists. That some cross-pollination took place between the movements is clear. In his article, Carpenter made particular reference to the famous Don't Shoot leaflet distributed among troops, for which Tom Mann, the union leader, and others were sent to jail. The true author of the leaflet was Fred Bauer, a Liverpool-based stonemason and syndicalist companion of Jim Larkin, who famously placed socialist greetings as a message to the future under the foundation stone of the Anglican Cathedral. Bauer was a member of the largely anarchist International Club in Liverpool and contributed talks to the Sunday School, while Peter Larkin, Jim's brother, was referred to as our comrade by Liverpool anarchists when advocating revolutionary syndicalist tactics during the summer of strikes in 1911. The aftermath of the police riot on Bloody Sunday and the killing of Michael Prendergast and John Sutcliffe saw frenetic anarchist activity in the city. Jim Dick reported in Freedom that every worker is now talking of revolution and redress. They will never be contented until things are substantially altered. The time is now ripe for active work. We in Liverpool are endeavouring to get as much literature as possible into the hands of the workers. They are simply thirsting for literature. The time is now ripe for the anarchists to push forward their ideas in a clear and decisive manner. Our work in the past has not been in vain. Let us once more get our heads down into the struggle. We have had 20,000 leaflets and all will be distributed amongst the workers. In the same edition, Samuel Henry Muston of Smithdown Lane affirmed that we are making a special effort in distributing leaflets, as now is the opportunity to drive home the lessons of the recent struggles. Again, the anarchist focus took on an anti-nationalist slant, Muston reporting that he had taken a number of Our Great Empire leaflets to a local military encampment, and after putting our view of the case to a crowd of soldiers, I was pleased to find they mostly agreed with us, and 6 of them took bundles of leaflets, promising to distribute them in the camp. Unfortunately, the upsurge in direct action did not result in lasting benefits to the local anarchist movement. The weeks that followed the strike saw parliamentary socialists attempt to turn the mood of militancy into electoral advantage, and Jim Dick noted with some bitterness Fred Bauer's decision to stand in local elections. Dick was soon to depart for London, where he was active in the anarchist Sunday school started by his partner Nellie. On securing the inheritance of Ferrer's modern school materials, Lorenzo Portet spent increasing periods away from the city in the years leading up to his death in Paris in 1916. While the Liverpool Anarchist Sunday School survived its initial eviction from the ILP rooms, it suffered from a more out-of-the-way location, and its activity dwindled in the absence of its most enthusiastic supporters. In spite of superficial similarities, Liverpool was not Barcelona, and it may be worth reflecting on whether van der Linden's notion of the national integration of working classes made port cities in Britain less receptive to the anarchist message than those in Spain. Rather than attempt a comparative taxonomy of the factors that constitute such integration, I want to end this talk by reflecting on imperialism and racism, referred to by van der Linden under the rubric of national prestige, as key ideological elements in this process of national integration. A year after the anarchist victims of the Montjuic process arrived in Liverpool, Spain lost its valuable colonies, the Philippines and Cuba. Known in Spain as the disaster, these events led to a widespread and multifaceted crisis and questioning of Spanish identity. This occurred in the midst of the so-called New Imperialism, when European imperial powers, with Britain at their head, expanded their overseas territories by 9 million square miles. In Britain, the language of patriotism provided a reservoir of discursive strategies that many socialists were happy to draw on to advance the claims of the workers. This was much less the case in Spain, patriotism being less persuasive, where the ruling class was less homogeneous, expansionist, and confident. Thus it was that while the call-up of reservists to fight in Spanish Morocco met with a near insurrection that would symbolize irreconcilable differences of class and culture within Spanish society for a generation, the Second Boer War was opposed in Britain not only by a minority of the working class, but by a minority of socialists, and the same would be true again in 1914. Although syndicalism emerged in this period as the most imposing revolutionary challenge the British imperial state faced within the borders of the metropole, it too was constrained by the limitations imposed by the dominant ideology. While the Great Transport Strike of 1911 is widely and justifiably seen as an important episode in the overcoming of sectarian divisions in the Liverpudlian working class, its impact on race relations is less clear. In the July 1911 edition of Freedom, Jim Dick reported on what he described as one of the little ironies of the Liverpool strike. In the language current at the time, Dick said, "An amazing incident happened last week. The coloured firemen of an Elder Dempster liner came out on strike in sympathy with the white men, and it was the dignified white men who scabbed them." Jim ended his report with the hope that the working class would learn by its mistakes, but the historical record, particularly the murderous riots of 1919, suggest otherwise. Fred Bauer relates an anecdote in his autobiography that further illustrates the point. In 1906, the Labour Party contested the seat of West Toxteth, held by the Tory tax exile and ship owner Robert Houston, shown here in a Vanity Fair illustration. Jim Larkin acted as election agent to the Labour candidate, and Bauer worked as his assistant. Bauer takes up the story. A day or two previous to the election, Jim had a great idea. This is Jim Larkin pictured here, by the way, on the left. The Boer War 3 or 4 years ago had not been forgotten. Chinese had been imported into South Africa to bring down the wages of white workers. The workers were told Africa was not a white man's country. They could fight in it and die in it, but couldn't stand the climate to work in it, and so on. This Houston then had voted for the Chinese Labour, so Chinese slavery was the battle cry against him. Bauer goes on to explain how Larkin hired a glass-sided hearse and several cabs, while lady Labour Party volunteers stitched cheap yellow overalls. Then 50 members of the Dockers Union were dressed in these Chinese outfits. To make it more realistic, Bauer relates, Larkin had got hold of some decoction, which he got the men to put on their faces and hands, which gave them a yellow countenance, and he himself had made them pigtails out of oakum, which they had pinned to their caps. The men then made up a funeral procession on the eve of the election, trailing behind a coffin-shaped box draped with the Union Jack, supposed, as Bauer put it, to represent the burial of freedom. It is remarkable that this macabre racist carnival could take place in the name of Labour internationalism, and the fact that it was remembered affectionately by Bauer, a member of the International Club and contributor to the Anarchist Sunday School, is revealing of how that concept was racialized in the minds of some of its advocates, perhaps especially in imperial centres such as Britain. From this point, the MP Houston, not one to look a gift horse in the mouth, became a vocal critic and fearmonger as to the Chinese presence in Liverpool. His campaign reached a crescendo in the spring of 1911, following a series of attacks on Chinese workers in Birkenhead, and continued into the summer as the seamen's strike gained momentum. Hansard records 16 interventions of Houston's with regard to aliens between April and August, the majority referring specifically to Chinese seamen. In April, he asked the Home Secretary whether legislation would be introduced to expel Chinese people from the country, and demanded of the President of the Board of Trade in August as to whether he had yet issued notices to British ship owners warning them of the danger of employing Chinese crews. Of course, it is more than possible that a shipping magnate and Tory did not require any lessons in divide and rule from his working class constituents, but it is notable that Houston's parliamentary career had been notable largely for his absence prior to the 1906 election, and that in opposing him, the city's organised working class revealed a point of weakness and division that he was only too happy to exploit. In bringing these episodes to attention, I'm not trying to besmirch the reputations of working class fighters like Bauer and Larkin, merely to illustrate the difficulty of internationalist class politics developing in a country in which imperial consciousness had formed something like a societal common sense in the latter part of the 19th century. The absence of such consciousness is not the only reason why Barcelona retained a revolutionary and highly anarchist influenced variety of syndicalism in the period that the Liverpool variety proved stillborn. But a notable consequence of that anarchist influence was that the attempts of local elites to divide the Barcelona working class along the lines of native-born Catalans and migrant workers from southern Spain were effectively resisted. The crisis of national integration that divided the European labour movement was not brought to a head in Spain until the outbreak of the Civil War. But consideration of the struggles of anarchism in Liverpool suggests that it had been resolved in Britain alongside and not subsequent to the emergence of the labour movement, and at any rate substantially before the anti-German riots of 1915 and racist riots of 1919 provided a sad and murderous epilogue to this process in that city and others. Inevitably, anarchism, which in essence is the variety of socialism most resistant to national integration, struggled to make headway within communities that sang God Save the King to anarchist exiles, and who were, even in a generous reading, open on occasion to excluding non-white workers from their conception of the international working class. But if anarchist internationalism was doomed in this context, it does not mean it was not worthwhile. The activities of the Liverpool Anarchist Sunday School sounded the alarm in a society sleepwalking into the 20th century, and we will never know how significant its impact may have been on the children who attended. In November 1914, Jimmy Dick reported to Freedom on the London school where he was now based. In spite of the struggle of many of our comrades to maintain the spirit of internationalism at the present juncture, we at least are still holding forth our ideal. On Sunday, October 18th, our young comrades were given a short account of Ferrer's life as an internationalist and educator. William Heaford, not being able to attend owing to illness, wrote, "I am glad to know that the school still thrives, and that the name and example of Ferrer remain as ever the cherished remembrance and encouragement of your school. In these terrible times of carnage and exultant triumphant violence in Belgium and France, it is well to remember Ferrer as the devoted advocate of human solidarity. He would have grieved over the spectacle of a torn and mangled Belgium and of a ravished and desolated France. No less would he have bemoaned the headlong rush to arms of scientists like Haeckel and of radicals and socialists at the behest of the warlords. The spectacle of today throughout Europe is saddening, and for this generation, and probably its immediate successor, disheartening to the highest degree. All the more need, therefore, for the growth of centres of light like your school as a protest against the barbarism which threatens 20th century civilization. Nellie and Jim Dick emigrated to the United States in 1917, shortly before the jingoistic publication John Bull published a double-page spread attacking the couple's educational efforts. Much later, in an interview with the BBC journalist Andrew Whitehead, when Nellie was asked why they had taught Esperanto at their school in London, she replied, "Because it was an international language. We were internationalists. For instance, when some of the boys who we had in the Sunday school got to be 14, and a couple of them were very well grown, tall, they were arrested and taken before the tribunal. You see, at that time, people around would pin a white feather on them. If they'd see a boy like that, 15 and tall, they'd pin a white feather on him. So they had them arrested. And one spoke up and he said he had no reason to join the army because he had no fight with the workers in Germany or anywhere else. So, although the forces of annihilation, as the Liverpool Mercury were pleased to call them, never succeeded in bringing about a society based on international brotherhood, they did at least save some individuals from the butchery being prepared by the forces of order." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danny. Has anybody got any questions they'd like to ask Danny?
Hang on, I just need to unmute everybody.
Right.
I know there's a button, I just can't remember where it is. I'll do it manually.
Danny, could I ask how much work has been done on the Anarchist Sunday School? Has no work been done at all on memories of children, years, decades later, of what they remembered? Has there been no oral history done on it?
Well, not as far as I know. There's been some investigation of it. Jeffrey Fiddler wrote articles on it. There's been a PhD thesis on anarchist educational efforts as well. But as to oral histories, I'm not aware of any. It would obviously be great to find some.
And it was called a Sunday school, and it was genuinely a Sunday school then, in the same way that the church Sunday schools were operating, kind of on a Sunday afternoon type thing, right? Yeah,
it was even included in a kind of like national inspection of socialist Sunday schools. But I think Sunday schools were fairly common in the period, but perhaps anarchist Sunday schools slightly less so.
Thank you.
James and James, are you both happy to have your questions recorded?
Yeah.
No. Yeah. I'll hand back to Arlene, but if we work on that assumption, we'll just keep going.
Okay, so James Kay first then. Would you like to ask your question?
Thank you. Yeah. I just wondered, one strand that I wondered whether might crop up was the influence on the formation of working class ideas of sectarianism within Liverpool, particularly around religion, issues of Orangism, Catholicism. And I know from a somewhat earlier, slightly earlier period, the Garibaldi riots caught up with sort of racism and division inside working class. Does that feature anywhere in your analysis?
Well, in the period that I look at, like syndicalist activists were very careful to try and unite Protestants and Catholic workers, and this was seen as one of James Larkin's great achievements. Well, in Belfast as well as Liverpool, and is seen as a phenomenon associated with the 1911 strikes, but I mean, it's also seen as important in the 1906 election campaign. Now, I might be getting mixed up here, but I think that this procession took place in a largely Protestant area, So I think, like in this case, like Chinese, like this idea of Chinese slave labor was being used as a kind of other to, a united and white working class, regardless of religion. But in terms of like how sectarianism impacted working class self-consciousness prior to this period, I don't really know, to be honest. It's an interesting question.
Thank you.
If I could just go, thanks for that, Daniel. That was really interesting. My work is on an earlier period, so apologies if this is somewhat redundant. But I am curious, when you were talking about the arrival of the anarchists in Liverpool and sort of narratives of fear that were in the press about foreigners coming in, and we should be scared. I was wondering if there were any linkages drawn between the anarchists arriving from Spain in this period and the coverage that had occurred only about a decade or so earlier about Fenian activity in Liverpool during the height of the Dynamite War and all that stuff. I'm seeing a lot of crossover in the way that they talk about Russian nihilists in the same breath as anarchists, and they talk about anarchists in the same breath as Fenians. And I'm not sure if in this late stage they're still doing that. As I say, I'm thinking more about the sort of 1870s, 1880s. But was there any crossover there in the way that they looked at them?
Well, I mean, I didn't see any in the newspaper reports that I looked at for doing the research for this talk, but it wouldn't be at all surprising. I think into the 20th century, anarchism was still being used as a kind of catch-all term for any violent opposition to the state, so including anti-colonial struggles, as well as then like Bolshevism was then largely incorporated into that language as well. So yeah, it wouldn't be at all surprising.
Thank you.
It would perhaps be interesting to look at how these different factors played into each other in debates around the Aliens Act, actually. And perhaps even more particularly after, sorry.
Sorry, I was just going to say, to the best of my knowledge, when you're in the parliamentary debates, they were, as you say, kind of lumped in together as these sort of, and the same kind of language that was used about anarchists coming from Spain or France or wherever, particularly after Greenwich, was the same kind of language that was applied to Russian nihilists and so forth in the 1880s. And they were, what's fascinating to me is how they were all kind of lumped together in this wider narrative of disgruntled radical people from foreign shores. And they're, irrespective of their grievance, we must fear them as one collective, was the sort of the interesting thing. So yeah, yes, it's interesting to know, because as I say, this period that you're looking at is still a bit hazy to me, but continuity, I guess.
I thought the cartoon that you showed from the Mercury was the character on the left-hand side was very typical of one that was used of Irish people, which I think must have been evident.
Yeah, that's a good point. But it's not actually from the Mercury. Sorry, I should have made that clear. It's from Punch, and it's actually almost certainly is referring to like well, I'm not sure what phase of like the Irish rebellion, but I think it probably is referring to Irish fighters. But like there's this in the kind of like racial taxonomies that the British press used to publish around this period at the turn of the century. Irish and Spanish were often lumped together as like a kind of racial type. The Ibero-Irish or something.
Yeah.
So like as a contrast to the Anglo-Teuton. So it is interesting to see like the anarchists portrayed in that kind of classically racialized way. It's a good point.
Could I just come in there? You've made me think about something, Danny, in talking about that. Although it's a much earlier period, if you look at some of the kind of basic woodcut imagery of the 1641 rising, of the Irish rising against Charles I's government in 1641, the images that come out from that show the Catholic rebels, as the king sees them, driving Protestants into rivers and drowning them, shows the Irish in Spanish military uniform. So the link there is clearly made between the Armada and kind of Spanish threats against the Elizabethan and the early Stuart state. It kind of goes hand in hand in a sense with how you see that. But it might well be that that tradition of Irish Spanish, in a sense, persists quite a long time then.
Yeah, and I think it's also relevant to thinking about like the kind of national pride with which Spanish anarchist torture victims were greeted, because I think the Inquisition was often like invoked in relation to the torture victims, and so you can almost, perhaps it's daft to think of like a continuity stretching back so far, but like a kind of anti-Spanish, perhaps anti-Spanishness is innate to British self-understanding. So, I don't know.
Can I just ask, surely with the start of the First World War, is nationalism within this country always going to trump internationalism? So that you've got those boys who attended Sunday school being given a white feather. So did that almost, sound a sort of death knell for people supporting it, the movement?
Yeah, but British anarchism really struggled in the interwar period. Well, in lots of places, anarchism struggled with the birth of Bolshevism. Really, I suppose there's different things going on. Like we can think of like the outbreak of the First World War is evidently a defeat, or like it signals the failure of a certain type of socialist internationalism that includes anarchism but stretches into like social democracy, Marxism, and what have you, as it has existed since the Paris Commune, but in terms of like whether internationalism, could survive that shock, well, it was from a specifically anarchist point of view, it was difficult to do that when the formed communist parties in the wake of the Russian Revolution was sort of monopolizing that kind of revolutionary internationalism. And it probably didn't help that a couple of key anarchists actually supported the Allied war effort, so had been somewhat besmirched by that. And the French revolutionary syndicalists have been divided as well in terms of their attitude. But yeah, it's certainly a case of nationalism trumping internationalism. We're still waiting for a reversal of that trend.
I just thought it was very interesting the way they still sang the national anthem at the Sunday school.
Amazing.
I know.
Mm-hmm.
I found that very. Oh, sorry, Arlene. I found that very interesting in a sense how whether there was a kind of whether there was a discussion beforehand about how will we have this meeting, this party, this meet and greet, and what shall we do, and who will bring the food and who will do whatever, and of course we'll sing the national anthem, or whether it was some kind of spontaneous thing at the end. I don't know. It's kind of strange that. But in follow on to what Arlene was saying, I think it always raises really interesting issues about the kind of the relative strength of views, principles, values that people have either been brought up with in the family or have picked up at school or in a kind of church organization, something like that, when that comes into conflict with values that the state is trying to impose. You kind of think about the Nazi German regime, isn't it? How do people who are brought up and then have to get kind of dragged into activities like the Nazi youth leagues and things, how does that impact on young people who've been brought up with maybe very different values but end up going along with something because it's very difficult not to? I think that does raise, And I know that's a level of pressure that perhaps is very difficult to resist, but perhaps going counterculturally to against a First World War national kind of patriotic view, maybe that's difficult, very difficult as well. You might not be facing the Gestapo knocking on the door, but in a sense, there's still that level of pressure, isn't there? It's probably very difficult to stand up against. Although clearly some religious groups do it, in a sense, things like the Quakers can kind of resist that.
Anybody, any more questions? In that case, Danny, can I just say thank you for such an interesting lecture. And let me say, I knew nothing about this before, so it's really interesting and all certainly new to me. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Everybody's muted themselves, so you couldn't actually see the clapping, I'm afraid.
Thank you, Danny.
Just tell everybody that our next lecture, this is for members, is on the 12th of May, and it's the Mike Stammers Memorial Lecture. Now, this is organised by the Centre for Port and Maritime History. Booking is again through Eventbrite, and I think you should have had a link from, if you remember, you should have already had a link. So thank you very much again, everybody, for coming. And I say a very, very stimulating and interesting lecture. I'm going away knowing a lot more about this period than I did when I came. Sorry, I'm my expertise is far earlier in the century. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for having me, and thanks for coming, everyone. It's such a nice day if you are in Liverpool. So thanks for staying inside for this. Hope you thought it was worth it.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Danny.
Yeah.
Thank you, Danny.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
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 Available soon. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.